So the starting point to study this is that the natural state of human existence is that life is not meaningful. That is the natural fallen state of human existence. So we're going to look at it through the eyes of Solomon, who wrote about this many centuries ago, 3,000 years ago. He wrote about this. So the first thing to consider is that the Bible says in Psalm 90, verse 12, that we should number our days, because numbering our days will give us wisdom. If we tend to live life like there's an infinite amount of time left, that we have n number of days left, we don't think about what is coming, we don't think about a time when we have to leave, then our approach to life will take the path of not looking at what is permanent, but really what is temporary, because we are here forever. When I was working as a software developer many years ago, there was a joke that people used to say during the end of the release cycle. Then we had a lot of bugs and we still had to ship, and we would say there's an infinite number of hours in the weekend, so we can take care of it. So that was a joke. Just work, postpone everything, and then get it done. We would work through the weekend and get it done and then ship. But we cannot live life like that. Life is finite, and we have a certain amount of time, and that's what we have to reckon with. And I think this culture in America is a little different than what we have in India. In India, we don't think about death very much, because death is considered to be painful, it's sorrowful, it's not something that we want to deal with. There's mourning and wailing when people die, and that's the reality that we face there. This culture is a little different. I think it's been steeped in Christianity for many years. So I remember that several years ago, I was about to get into a meeting with a colleague of mine. It was in my office, so I had some music playing in the background, and she came into my office. She's younger than me, a little bit younger than me. And she said, I like that song because that's the song my husband has chosen for his funeral. So I was a little taken aback. That's not something that we hear in India, where, I think this was when I was 40 years old, and she probably was less than that. And we don't think about death when we are 38, and we don't pick out our funeral song. But that's how, God tells us to live our life like that. You have to look at the end, and then, you can plot a path towards meaning. Without that end in sight, it's very difficult to bring up meaning in life. So, So we're going to look at this. So we're going to look at first. We have to look at it through the eyes of Solomon, who lived many years ago. So we'll look at this meaning in life through the eyes of Solomon, who lived many thousands of years ago. Now Solomon, the Bible says, when God appeared to him in a dream and asked him what he wanted, he chose to ask for wisdom. He didn't ask for money, or he didn't ask for his enemies to be vanquished, or anything like this. So he asked for wisdom, and God was very pleased with that response. So we read that in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 11. It says that God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I shall have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So God gave him something that was very unique. He gave him wisdom, he gave him honor, he was the king, he had unlimited power, and he also gave him great riches. So that's something that we read. The fame of Solomon in the old ancient world spread throughout that area, and we read about the Queen of Sheba coming and talking to Solomon, quizzing him on his wisdom, And then learning that she says that whatever she had heard was not enough to describe his wisdom. So he was such a wise man, someone who was given all kinds of knowledge in those times. Also, people have calculated his wealth based on descriptions in the Bible, and they say it's about $2.1 trillion in today's dollars. That's the kind of wealth that he had. He had extensive mines, and his kingdom was he had a kingdom that extended from the Mediterranean on the west to the Euphrates on the east, and then it went all the way up to Lebanon in the north and the Red Sea in the south. So he controlled a vast swath of territory, and he had a lot of wealth and honor and also power. But and we read that this is also something that I found interesting. It says in 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 22 that Solomon's provision for one single day, his meals and his banquet table, was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, and 10 fattened oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebuck, and fatted fowl. So one core is approximately 230 liters. So that's the extent of his life on a daily basis. He had that kind of a banquet set before his people, the people in his court, and that's how he lived. Such a lavish life was what he was used to, basically. Now, Solomon, in his wisdom, there's a specific reference in the Bible to Solomon's wisdom. It says that Solomon spoke in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32. It says he spoke 3,000 proverbs and his songs were 1,005. And he spoke of trees from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish. And men of all nations from all kings of the earth who heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. So he was it's described in very specific detail. He knew about the plants, he knew about the animals. He was given wisdom that was not seen on earth at that time. So a lot of people came to hear him, and it was something that he understood, and he spoke to them, and they were all convinced about his wisdom. But ultimately, we also learn that Solomon received a failing grade from God. So it was this man who was given riches beyond measure, wealth beyond anybody's dream. He was given power beyond measure. He was given all of this education, wisdom, everything. He ultimately earned a failing grade. So that's also documented in the Bible. You go to 1 Kings 11:4. We read that Solomon married many women, and they turned his heart away from God. And it says in 11:6, Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not fully follow the Lord as did his father David. Solomon built a high temple for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burnt incense and sacrificed to their gods. Therefore God said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my commandments and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not give it in your days for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. So he ultimately was given a failing grade. Even though he himself built the temple for God, he was allowed to build the temple. David was not allowed to build the temple, but Solomon built the temple. Ultimately, God said, in summation, you have not done right, and you get a failing grade. But Solomon, I think the good thing about Solomon is that he learned that this was his fate, and we believe that he turned from his ways at the end of his life. And he penned this journal that we refer to as Ecclesiastes. So it's a very different book in the Bible. It's very different from other books in the Bible in the sense that there are specific things that have to be taken in context. So we'll talk about that before we go into it and study it. There are two things that we need to take into account, two definitions. So Solomon keeps using the term under the sun. So that is something that you will see again and again. It appears 29 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. So it's very important to define under the sun. Under the sun in this context really means not just what happens on earth, but also what happens on earth without God, or apart from God. So you have to keep this in mind because all of the things that he says are apart from God. So if you have God, then it's a different situation. But if you don't have God, the natural state, apart from God, that is what he's referring to when he says under the sun. So the number of statements that he makes, number of musings that you will go through that talk about the meaninglessness of life, but they are under the sun, which you literally take it as apart from God. The other term that will come up often is vanity. So vanity in today's term is pride. Most people, if you say vain or vanity, you will refer to it as pride. But in this context, it does not refer to pride. It refers to what you can think of as a mist or a vapor or a steam, something that's fleeting, something that's temporal, something that has no value beyond a few moments. So that's also used 38 times in Ecclesiastes. So these are the two structural terms that we need to keep in mind before we look at his musings. So under the sun, apart from God, and then vanity is a vapor, just a steam or mist. So the very first musing that he has is what we read, is chapter 1. Solomon says that the earth is permanent. There's a hydrological cycle, there's rains and water, the sun comes up in the morning, it sets in the evening. God has set everything in its place and everything works, and the mountains are there, the streams are there, the wind comes, the wind blows from the north to the south and returns back to the north. So all of these things are permanent. But human life is not permanent. Whatever the greatness of those people that we have, they are not remembered. I have two people here, and I don't know if some of you may be able to recognize one or two of them. You probably looked at my slides. But can anyone else remember these two folks that are seen on the screen? Not you guys. The person we see on the left is Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State under Nixon and later under Ford. And he was a very powerful man back in his day. He's still alive. I think he's 98 years old. I looked it up. And many years ago, I think it was 15 years ago, I was at Charles de Gaulle Airport waiting to board a flight to Washington from Paris. And I saw an elderly gentleman walk right past the turnstile, and he had just one person with him carrying a little briefcase. And I looked at him and said, that is Henry Kissinger. I remember seeing his pictures. And nobody in the crowd recognized him. There were like 200 people waiting to board that aircraft. And this was one of the most powerful men in the world in the 70s. And nobody recognized him. But then after he came to the gate, a few people said, that's Kissinger. And I could hear some murmurs. Again, 4 or 5 people. But nobody else knew who he was. So that's the fate of fame. I mean, you can be at the height of power and then, you're gone. And this person that you see on the right is Benjamin Harrison, who was the 23rd president of this country, 23rd president of the United States. And nobody, you can present this picture to a lot of children, students of history, nobody will remember it. And it doesn't matter, there have been only 45, 46 presidents. It doesn't make it, when they are in power for those 4 years, they can decree all kinds of things, they can, go from here to there, declare war, do all of these things, but nobody remembers them at the end. That's really what Solomon is saying. I mean, you can seek after all of these things, you can seek after your name, you can build a name, but at the end of the day, you're not going to have anything. That's the thing, and he says this in Ecclesiastes 1:11. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. How many of us remember who our great-grandfather was or great-grandmother was? Or even if we do, one generation removed, it's not possible. Nobody knows. And that's the same for us. I mean, 2, 3 generations down, nobody will know that we existed. That's the reality of life. Okay. So that's one of his musings, and I think Solomon's wisdom really comes through in these writings because there's not much that you can disagree with. The state of the world has not changed. He wrote this 3,000 years ago. He perceived these things, but the natural state of the world has not changed in 3,000 years. Now, this picture that you see here, Solomon talks about the vanity of wisdom. In this context, he was already wise, but he says he went out and sought more wisdom, education. He read, he learned about a lot of things. He said, I'm going to set my heart on learning and knowing all of these things. And we see a picture of two people. One you probably can recognize quickly, Billy Graham, and the other is Charles Templeton. You probably have, some of you have heard of Charles Templeton. Charles Templeton was one of the founders of Youth for Christ in the 40s. He was one of the 3 vice presidents. Youth for Christ appointed Billy Graham as one of their first full-time evangelists to preach. And later, towards the end of the 40s, I think it was 1948, Charles Templeton wanted to go and get education. So he said he was not very well educated and he felt like he had to go and get a formal theological education. So he went to Princeton Theological Seminary. And Billy Graham remembers that he had a discussion and he discouraged him from going to Princeton. He wanted to go to Oxford because Princeton was very low at that time, and still is. But Charles Templeton chose to go to Princeton. And just a year later, he had a meeting with Billy Graham and he said, "Hey, Billy, you're 50 years behind the times. Nobody believes in the literal inerrancy of the Bible anymore. You have to change these things. Otherwise, you're not going to really progress in your ministry." And it was something that shook Billy Graham because the two of them had preached together for many years. But Charles Templeton never came back, basically. He wrote a book, Farewell to God, and you may not want to read it, but it's available. So it's education itself, under the sun. Again, I want to remember, keep this in mind. I'm not talking about education itself. Education is a good thing. Just like, getting a name, doing good things is a good thing, education is also a good thing. But under the sun, apart from God, education is not going to really help. It doesn't make you any better. It doesn't make you, sometimes it can make you worse. So that's something that we have to see here. As Solomon says this in Ecclesiastes. He says that 1:17, he reads, "I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, but perceive that this is also grasping for the wind," meaning the fleeting, there's nothing there. "And for much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." Emmanuel Malford was a British commentator who lived in the last century, and he said that education is the great mumbo jumbo and fraud of the ages. It purposes to equip us to live and is prescribed as a universal remedy for everything from juvenile delinquency to premature senility. For the most part, it only serves to enlarge stupidity, inflate conceit, enhance credulity, and put those subjected to it at the mercy of brainwashers with printing presses, radio, and television at their disposal. You can add the internet to that. And it's unfortunately that's the state of mind under the sun. Again, apart from God, if you believe that education is going to give you salvation, that is the outcome that you experience. And that's what Solomon talks about here. And then the next thing Solomon talks about is the vanity of pleasure. So he says that he set his heart to seek pleasure, and these are all, you can think of these as experiments and musings. He talks about his life. He had access to a lot of pleasure, and then he says that he didn't find meaning in pleasure either, basically. Pleasure we define as primarily as an approach to pleasure is hedonism. So we say that seek pleasure and avoid pain. But one thing about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain is normally, if you want to buy something, if you want to buy a phone, you can go to the store and say, "This is the money," and you get a phone. You want to buy a book, you ask for the book and you pay for it and you get it. But pleasure is not like that, and this is not something that is just Solomon observing this. This is true even today. It's referred to as the hedonist paradox or the pleasure paradox. If you go and seek pleasure, you don't get it. But only if you don't seek it and you do things that are fulfilling, then you get pleasure as a result of it. It's called it's a paradox. So it's a very important thing to keep in mind. So someone who drinks alcohol, it says, shortly thereafter has withdrawal and a lot of pain as a result of that. Then he has to go back and drink again, and you have to keep doing that. And there's no permanency in those kinds of pleasures. And years ago, we were we went to a conference in Las Vegas and stayed at this large casino called Bellagio. And the thing that I found very interesting is you can go any time of the day, basically. They have gardens inside the casino. It's lit up like daylight, 24 hours a day. The reason is that they don't want people to think that it's nighttime and they have to go back and get rest. They want people to be gambling 24 hours a day. So breakfast is available at 9 p.m. at night, and you see people in bathrobes and fully flooded, and the streets that are inside the casino, and they're sitting there eating breakfast. They have no sense of time at all, basically, because you want people to lose that sense of time, and you go back, you get worked up, and then you go back, you maybe get a little bit of rest, then you come back again to the gambling floor. There's no end to it. You just keep doing that, and you know the consequences of that. You end up broke, or you end up really sick, or dead. And that's really what Solomon says. He says, I said in my heart, come, I will test you with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this was also vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? And then he talks about all the things he did. I made myself gardens and orchards, he built these great houses. And at the end of it, he says that he became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained in me. He didn't lose his wisdom. It's not that seeking pleasure he lost his wisdom. Wisdom was decreed for Solomon by God, so he did not lose his wisdom. So he went after all these things. Most people who go after all these things lose their mind. But he did not lose his mind. He had his wisdom with him. And still, he says, then I looked at all the works my hands had done and all the labor in which I toiled. And indeed, all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. So again, the conclusion is really the same. I mean, he went after pleasure. He did all of these things. He had unlimited money, unlimited resources, unlimited power, and he tried everything. And at the end of the day, he was found left wanting again. The next thing he talks about is the vanity of work. So again, keep in mind, this is not about work itself. Work is a good thing, and we read that in many places in the Bible that work is a good thing, and you should work. So it's not about taking rest. But the vanity of work apart from God. So if you seek fulfillment just in work, and you're going 24/7, and you're working with the idea of climbing that one more rung in that ladder, there's one more rung in that ladder. There's always someone above you. It's not going to end. When I was young, when I was a software developer, I looked at all my senior managers and thought, oh, life is easy for them. They come and they go when they please. They come when they please. And then later I realized that was not the case, basically. And as you get up the rung, your headaches multiply. It doesn't get any better. I mean, the software developer days are much nicer because you just do your work and it's between you and your computer. If something's broken, you fix it and you go home. It's not that way when you keep going one round. But that's what motivates people. It's just you keep. And Solomon says that even back then people stay up at night. They don't get sleep, and there is no rest because you're constantly seeking one more mountain to climb. There's one more mountain to climb, one more mountain to climb. And he says that just keep in mind that none of these things are permanent because somebody else will be sitting in your seat in a few years. So you're not going to have this forever, and this is a position that you have it, and somebody else has it. He was talking about the kingdom, right? He's the king, and it's not that he's going to be king for 1,000 years. He's going to be king for another 5 years, 10 years, and then his son or who knows, somebody else might be sitting on his throne. And that's the conclusion that you have. You can keep going, but nothing is really permanent. So he says. I hated all my labor in which I toil under the sun because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And that really ticks him off because he had done all this work, accumulated all this wealth, and he doesn't have it. And you see this today basically. You go and you search for it. All the rich people are looking for a cure, for a way to become immortal. Because they have $100 billion and they don't know what to do with it, they cannot spend it their lifetime. But the only way they can spend it is to extend their life. So they're all funding in $200 million, $300 million to extend their life. To get another 20 years of good years, 30 years of good years. That's what he's talking about here. Can I have a little bit more time? I mean, I have all this money, but God says, no, I mean, you don't have that time. You have only what is set for you, and it doesn't matter whether you have $2 trillion, you cannot attach a U-Haul to your coffin and then take it all with you and spend it where you go. It's gone and goes to somebody else. So that's something, whether it's position or power, and we'll talk about wealth also. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. The successor, whether he will be wise or a fool. You gather all of this and give it to someone who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toil and which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. So this is something that he says again. You can do all of this, but ultimately apart from God, it's all vanity. The next thing that we look at is wealth. So Solomon, he was a very wealthy man, and his picture of Vanity is huge. Christmas Carol. Wealth does not satisfy. And years ago, I had a friend who came with me at the same time. We went to college together in India, and he came with me here. He went to study MBA, and then he went on to work in wealth management. And one day when I was speaking with him, he said that his company surveys people that they service. I mean, most of them have money invested in the stock market, and this company is managing that money. They were investment advisors. And he said every year they survey their clientele. And one thing that they find consistently every year is that there is a certain point at which your satisfaction with wealth starts dropping. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think it was $1 million or $1.5 million. Until that point, people are very happy. They're gaining wealth and they feel like they have enough money for living a comfortable life. And at that point, the numbers start dropping. Their satisfaction with life starts dropping. And you go to 5 million and 10 million and 50 million and 100 million, they become less miserable. That's what he said basically. And I also found several studies to back it up. There was a study that was done by Purdue University, another study in the journal Nature. They all say the same thing. Your income level, if you go, and this was in 2018, they said if you reach $105,000 in America, then you're very happy with your financial life. You say, okay, this is really good. I'm making good money and I'm happy. And then it starts dropping. So you go to 200, you go to 300, you go to 400, you go to 1 million, you go to 10 million. You would expect it to rise, but it doesn't. It drops. And that's what Solomon's saying. He says, more money is more wants, more money means more isolation, more money means more work. And you just cut off from all reality and you live in an insulated world. And again, remember, I'm not talking about wealth, I'm talking about wealth apart from God. So this is important. I mean, this is not saying that more money is bad. I mean, that's not the reason. That's not what is being mentioned here. But under the sun, apart from God, these are the consequences of that. And Solomon also says the same thing. He says in Ecclesiastes 5:10, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. So that is the reality of wealth, and he very clearly says that. And it's so beautifully illustrated. If you, every Christmas we watch the Christmas Carol, sometimes we go see it in person as a play, and Charles Dickens is immensely talented. He brings it out. Ebenezer Scrooge's life, he accumulates, and there's no meaning in his life. And then he meets God form of intervention in his life, and then his life is transformed. That's what Solomon is saying here. Under the sun, this is really what he observes with wealth. Okay, next thing is justice. So Solomon also sees that there is no justice on earth. So he observes that there is no justice on earth. And we keep reading, I mean, there are thousands of stories that you can read about. There is no earthly justice. And anybody who promises you earthly justice is taking you for a ride or looking to put a noose around your neck. That's the reality of it. So we, I think a few years ago, and this was a movie also, Just Mercy. And if you read the book, I read the book, didn't watch the movie, but I read the book. It talks about the story of Walter McMillan, who was a black man who was convicted of murdering a girl who was a clerk at a laundromat. So he had many alibis at the same time. That he was a public church event, it was a church fish fry. So there were so many people who said that he was there. He was with them and he was eating with them and he was hanging out with them. And he was there the whole day. But they had witnesses who ultimately were proven to be false witnesses. And they sentenced him to death. He was on death row for 6 years. And if you read the book, he was kept within view of the death house. They had a little chair. People were being executed, and he lived under those conditions for 6 whole years. Ultimately, the Alabama Supreme Court in 1993 threw out the conviction. 87 he was sentenced, and he comes out of prison. And in that case, at least some form of justice has been done. So there's a saying that all earthly justice can hope to achieve is to minimize injustice. That's really all it can hope to do, and its best. That's all it can hope to do. It cannot do more than that. It cannot provide justice. Can hope to minimize injustice. So Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 3:16, moreover I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a plan there for every purpose and for every work. So he's talking about the lack of earthly justice. So he was the king, and he went to the courts, and he sees that the courts are corrupt. And can he change it? Can he fix it? No, because the whole system depends on everything else. So if you're the king, you cannot say, okay, I'm going to remove everybody and start all over again. That doesn't work. He knows that. So he says that he goes to see the courts, and he knows how the court system works. He's been king long enough to know that people are not getting justice. So that's another important thing. The next thing is oppression. Oppression is very real. How many of you know who this is? So this is Napoleon the Big from Animal Farm. It's George Orwell's Animal Farm. So George Orwell wrote a parody of the Russian Revolution. It's a very beautiful book. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. It talks about the vanity of humans rising up and saying we're going to end oppression. So the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, Lenin said that 20 million people died over the course of the next century. And the SARS, I think all the SARS put together had not massacred as many people, not even 100 of those people. So they promised that they would end oppression. And this is what they did. 20 million people died. In Animal Farm, the animals in the farm, they don't like their owner. There's an owner. This took place in Britain, in Vanity, and Mr. Jones is the owner. Mr. Jones is not a kind man. He's alcoholic. He treats the animals poorly. He doesn't feed them and all that. So the animals conspire. They say, okay, let's overthrow him and let's take over. So they overthrow him and they take over. And Napoleon the Big is the one who's appointed to be in charge. In the beginning, they have these 7 commandments that all animals are equal and nobody will be killed, no animals will be killed, and all 2-legged creatures are enemies, all 4-legged creatures are our friends. So they will have those commandments. And over time, one step at a time, the pigs will slowly accumulate their power. They will have an army of dogs to enforce their will. And before long, everything will apply to the animals, but not to the pigs. So Napoleon will be one level above all the animals. And eventually, at the end of the book, Napoleon wears a suit, and he is talking with the human counterparts, who own the other farms, and he's doing business with them. So that's the reality of oppression. It's not going to go away. China now promised to end oppression. 65 million people were killed. 65 million. So this is the kind of talk. When people say, "Oh, I'm going to get justice for you. You give me a vote, I'll give you justice." Bloodbath will come. That's really what you're looking at. That's the oppression that you're going to face. Even here, even in America, most people will say that the Constitution is what gives us liberty. It's not true, basically, because the natural state of man is not to be free. It is to be oppressed. The reason that we have liberty, and John Adams said this, he said that the Constitution is for moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for any other. The liberties that we have are only granted here because of the predominant Christian worldview under which this country was born. And as we lose it, those will also go. They're not guaranteed by any documents. Cannot be guaranteed by any documents. That's what Solomon says. He says there's oppression and there's not much you can do about it. Ecclesiastes 4:1. Then I returned and considered all the oppression that was done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. So anybody who pretends to be their comforter will turn out to be their oppressor. So you look at, they'll say, this people was vanquished and they took land away from this other people group. But then you go back another 100 years in history, and who did that people group get that land from? Were the people before them? There were people before them. They were driven out, and then another people came in. So this is the story of history. So oppression is there from the beginning of history and will continue until the end of history, apart from God. So that's really what Solomon says here. And then another observation that he has is life is not fair. So he says that you observe that it doesn't mean you look at someone who has a lot of money or who has a lot of degrees and you think that maybe they're wise. But that is not true. Solomon says that is not true. And you go to Africa, you go to India, you see a lot of people who are far smarter than us, and they don't have anything. And that's just the reality of life. You cannot say that this is you did this and you studied and you did this. That's all true, basically. I think the Bible also says that you have to work hard. But you have to keep in mind that when you sow, you're not guaranteed to reap. Unless the Lord of the harvest says that you can reap, you cannot reap. And that's the reality. Life is not fair. It's just sometimes the turtle will win, sometimes the hare will win, sometimes neither will win. That's the reality that we see in the world. Ecclesiastes 9:11, Solomon says, "I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill. But time and chance happen to them all." So all things can go right or go wrong, and that's the reality. For man does not know his time, that like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. Nothing you can do. That's the reality that he observes. And then the other thing, this is a very obvious conclusion, but he also concludes that whether you're rich or poor, whether you're wise or foolish, death comes to everybody. So there's nothing that you can do about it. So he says, for him who is joined to all the living there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. So he talks again, apart from God, death is final. If you think of this apart from God, you observe that people die every day, people are born every day, people die every day, and that's the end of it. There's nothing beyond that, apart from God. And then we come to his conclusion. So the conclusion is that he says that God, in all his meaninglessness, he makes a few conclusions. And I think that will carry us to the next phase. One conclusion he says early on in chapter 3, verse 11, is that he says God has put eternity in our hearts. So in all his meaninglessness, it is not, man is not able to live with the meaninglessness. There is always that seeking after meaning. And the reason is that God puts eternity in the heart of man. It doesn't matter whether people know God or not, but it's universally true that God put eternity in their heart. So there's always a constant seeking for why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? What is the meaning of my life? And that's not something that comes from external factors, but Solomon says that God put eternity in their heart. He has made everything beautiful in his time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work of God, the work that God does from beginning to end. So, mysteries, but God put eternity in the heart of man. And then in Ecclesiastes 12:13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. That's one conclusion. The other conclusion is in verse 14. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So, and this is where he ends. And I think it dovetails perfectly with the gospel. Because he raises all of these existential questions, something that everybody can relate to. There's nothing to disbelieve in what he says. I mean, you can talk to someone who doesn't believe in the Bible, doesn't believe in God, and they will agree with everything that is stated in Ecclesiastes. Because that's what you see in the world. That is the natural state of man. That is the fallen state of creation, which we see from Genesis. But you can also start from Ecclesiastes. You can say that this is where we are. And then the next stage, Jesus is the answer to all the issues, all the existential issues that are raised in Ecclesiastes by Solomon. The solution comes in the form of the gospel in the person of Jesus Christ. And that's the end conclusion. And we see that God did not leave us in our fallen state, but he sent his son, so he would die, and then he would give us life. And change people from a life of meaninglessness to a life of meaningfulness. And that's the key thing. So everything, all of these things, so if you take work, if you take wealth, if you take any of those things, all of them have meaning as long as you are living under the guidance of God, under the umbrella of God, then all of them have meaning. I'll give you an example, just to illustrate. So a lot of wealthy people are miserable that we talked about. But many years ago, when I was in London, I was working in fast food for some time, and I did fast food delivery. So one evening I went, it was raining, I had, I think it was pizza or something to deliver, so I delivered it. It was not in a very rich neighborhood or anything, very ordinary place, few students living together. And they were just getting together, I think it was Friday evening, and they just wanted some pizza, and they ordered it, so I delivered it. And I was about to leave, and this is the first time I've seen this in this country. So this guy said, hey, just wait, just hang on a minute. And he went in, and he didn't have any money. He was rummaging around, and And then he got $2 out and gave it to me. He said, take it. And I was like, I was surprised basically because in current India, I didn't expect that kind of generosity. He didn't have anything, but he wanted to make sure that I got something because I was there in the rain delivering that pizza. So that, it stuck with me all the days after that. I said, this is something that I've not seen before. And this is the kind of transformation under the Christian worldview. Even if you don't have anything, you can be generous. Even if you don't have anything, you can be generous. So from that day, it changed me. I mean, wherever I go, whether I had money or not, I always made sure that I gave 20%, 30%, 40% sometimes as a tip. Because that single action that I think he was a student, but I'm not sure, he didn't have anything. We rummaged for maybe 5 minutes and then gave it those $2. And to me, that was a lot of money back then. I remember they used to sell those king-size Snickers bars for $1. I could buy them and eat them. Now I got the sugar problems, so I eat them. But back then, I could happily buy one of those and eat them on the way home. It's $2. But the message is that you can be generous. You can be generous. Under this worldview, under God, not under the sun, but under God, you can be generous. You don't need to have anything, but you can be generous. So that's the important thing. And we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. All things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. Now all things are of God, who has reconciled us to himself through Jesus Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. So it says that this is beyond what we are able to observe. This is not about what we are able to observe on earth, but about what we are going to see beyond earth. So that's the most important. That's why there is big meaning in life, because the earthly existence is meaningless. But if we set our eyes on something beyond our earthly existence, then we see meaning. Then our priorities will change, basically. Then we will not be solely bound by what we see here, the dangers we see here, the downfall we see here, the meaningless kind of really, we accumulate more and more and more. All of that is good, but only in the context of God. And we here also believe that God, on removing justice and oppression, God will wipe every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for all the former things have passed away. Revelation 21:4. God will give us the ability to work and be fruitful. God will give us the ability to enjoy what is given to us. And more importantly than anything else, God will remember us in His kingdom. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for this time. We pray that you will bless these words and that we will be able to take them to heart and to take your wisdom to heart and to act on it. Pray that you will bless the rest of this time. This is in Jesus' name. Amen.